Okay, welcome. Today I'm going to be offering some reflections on the strategic survival personality of boarding school syndrome and the work of Nick Duffell and Wounded Leaders. And in particular, I'm just going to talk about the compliers today. So today I'm going to look into some of the work of Nick Duffell and his work around this strategic survival personality. So what he's saying here, and I'll quote some of his words, is that when we get to boarding school, we basically need to survive. Our parents aren't there, and it is a place, as George Chavarin says, that there is no love. And so we have to find a way to survive. We might be 7, we might be 8, we might be 10, 11, or even 13. We have to survive. And what Nick is proposing here is that we bring online these 3 types, which are complier, we bring online the rebel, or the crushed. And, what I found in my work with ex-boarders over the last 6 or 7 years is that people usually fall into one of these 3. And as Nick says here, he says they are rough guides rather than determined categories, and an individual can sometimes combine aspects of more than one type. So for me, at school, and then on leaving school, I was always a complier. I was thinking this at school. I never got a detention, which is pretty amazing for a teenager, but I was always getting my homework on time. I was always following all the rules. I was always, doing what I was told to do. I think there was an aspect of the rebel there in my music, but, I wasn't ever breaking school rules I was drinking, but I'd never caught. So that's the thing of the rebel, and I'll go into more detail about that for next week. But essentially, he says, in our quest to understand the psychological problems unconsciously acted out in the elite circles of British politics, there remains, after the 3 levels of dissociation, one further aspect of the ex-boarder's profile to consider. I want to briefly introduce a further tripartite typology, survivor types. These I categorize as compliers, rebels, and the crushed. These types apply to adult ex-boarders, though they may well have been practicing for the role as children in school. In my impression at school, that there was certainly those 3 categories. On each year, boarding house, we had 12, 14 people on each year. There was 1 crushed, possibly 2, but usually it was 1. Richard Beard, in his book Sad Little Men, talks about the custos, saying that if you were in your year group and you couldn't see the custos, you knew it was you. So knowing that there was always one crushed, and essentially the crushed was the person who was bullied, but they couldn't put up that survival defense mechanism of disassociating. They didn't have a sufficient survival personality. So I began, personally, being a complier, I towed the line, but also became emotionally shut down. I didn't show any, emotions, anger, or, certainly not publicly. And, I didn't show my vulnerability. So I became the complier. There's also the rebel. The rebel is that part, on each year that we had maybe 1 or 2 rebels who would smoke, or they were, caught. They might have been suspended. They wouldn't do what they were told. They were kind of one of the problem cases that the master would see. So, to reflect on, there's also this book here, Trauma, Abandonment and Privilege, as well, where he talks about this. So in the book about trauma, abandonment and privilege, he says the compliers or conformists. These survivors are usually in denial of the problems of boarding and have identified with the values of the school. Better to be on the winning side. Their motto can be, "It never did me any harm." Compliers tend to thrive in institutions after school. This is the class which is naturally most represented in the public world of business and politics. So, the percentage wise, and I can't remember if it was Nick or I've read it somewhere or just my sense is, you probably had 90% of the year were compliers. You probably had 6, 7, 8%, so 1 or 2 people were the rebels, and then you got 1 person who was the crushed. Those were kind of the figures. So it might be 80, 15 and 5 or something like that if you're looking at percentages. And this is also a representation in society. If you look at British society, we also have the compliers who do what the government says. We then also have the rebels who question, and then you've got the people who can't cope with the society. So he also goes on to say compliers tend not to seek therapy, but sometimes life intervenes. All goes well until they seem no longer to be on the winning side. For example, when something happens, such as the loss of their job or an ultimatum from their spouse or partner. When their own child is born or reaches boarding age, they may discover a chink in their armour. Then they may suddenly connect to some of the unrecognized needs of their inner child from whom they have distanced themselves. So I was certainly that complier until I had my breakdown really in 2000, and I started to question my sanity. And at that point, the chink arrived. I'm like, I'm falling apart, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't have access to Nick Duffell's work. That would be another 2 years before I got help. So during that time, I just fell apart, and I went wildly off course by, into drinks. I was homeless for a little while, living on people's sofas. So, it can be an unsettling time when the chink of armour comes in. What I would suggest, if you're noticing that, if you're a complier, is, seek support, whether it is a therapist, a coach, or a men's circle or something, or one of Nick Duffell's workshops. It's like, seek support with that. Drawing on some of the other quotes, compliers are the main defenders of the status quo and the upholders of the system, and are embedded in it. Such characters do not tend to appear in therapy, but on the rare occasion they do, it is usually as a result of a sudden, unpredicted problem that threatens to break down their functioning level. They will leave as soon as the problem is fixed. Sometimes they may discover a chink in their armour when a child is born. I've just said that. This dissociative process then suffers a failure, which may be permanent or temporary, according to how the individual deals with it. The determined complier type will maintain his dissociation at all costs, even if there may be the odd hiccup. Compliers are above all things loyal, especially to institutions and ideals, like the party whip, which is so often successful in the Conservative Party. They have a strong tendency to support each other's compliancy. So those are just some ideas of the complier. What else did I want to say here about the complier? So with that complier, if you're with a therapist or you're in a group, you realize, one, that you're not alone. So if that chink comes up, it's like, tears, I'm falling apart. It's like, brilliant. That's great. As I often say in my work with clients, it's like at boarding school, we build up this reservoir of emotions. We keep suppressing until it becomes a bit untenable. It's like, oh my God, it's starting to crack, and the sluice gate which lets the water out of the dam is broken, and it's just getting these outbursts because you can't keep building this reservoir up high. The reason I had my breakdown in my 20s is I'd had so much trauma at boarding school and early life is that it couldn't go any higher. It was starting to crack. And that often happens, and that's why Judith Herman, the psychiatrist, talks about in her book, Trauma and Recovery, is that it's usually in your 30s and 40s, 50s, when you start to explore this, because you can't keep pushing down into the basement, this stuff. You can't keep building this wall. And that's what happens with the complier. And the therapist will say, or coach, this is just normal. What Nick Duffell says, here the therapist will do well to remind the client of the inherent opportunity in the breakdown. It feels like a disaster, but from the vantage point of getting out of the grip of the survival personality, it can be reframed as a huge opportunity. The loss of ability to split or to function is a sign that their unconscious mind wants them to do more than just survive. It wants them to embrace living. So I often say this idea that at school we've learned to suppress the lover part. If you imagine you've got the four archetypes: the king, the warrior, the magician, the lover, or the sovereign or the queen. And the lover we suppress. That's the feeling, that's the sensitive part, the creative side, the joyful part, that's squashed. And therefore we live like this zombie-like existence, both at school and post. So part of our work in the healing is to grieve, which brings this lover back on, and then the joy coming back to embrace living. What do I love doing? What is it, I enjoy? What brings me passion? Oh yeah, I love walking, or I love being in the woods. Right. Do more of that. And it goes on to say the compliers and the conformists in therapy will often, leave quite quickly. So if you notice you're a complier, the invitation with therapy, coaching, with the inner work is to keep going. See it as a life journey, really. Those are just some reflections on the complier. I'm trying to think if I've got any other notes on here. Compliers. Yeah, it says some have a touch of rebel in them, like Tony Blair, which gives them some charisma and energy. But in the end, their establishment loyalties come to the rescue, and they stay true to form. So, just to give you some ideas and insights into the complier of the strategic survival personality. Any questions, anything not clear, please do let me know. Okay, next week I'll do the rebel, and the week after that the crushed.